The story begins in a world where wealth builds walls higher than any fence, and status divides people more than oceans ever could. She was the daughter of a millionaire, a girl who had grown up in a mansion filled with chandeliers and polished floors that reflected her every step. But strangely, she had always felt a kind of emptiness that luxury could never fill. Every morning when she walked past the main gates, she would see him standing there, the black security guard, dressed in a simple uniform, his posture strong yet humble, his eyes carrying a depth of life's struggles and dignity. At first, she barely noticed him, but one morning, everything changed. She saw him bend down to help an old woman who had dropped her groceries outside the mansion. He didn't care that no one important was watching. He didn't care that his job description was to guard the property, not assist strangers. He did it because it was who he was, human, kind, selfless. And in that single moment, something stirred in her heart that no amount of her father's millions had ever awakened. It was not love at first sight, but it was something deeper, something that made her pause. For the first time, she saw a man not through the lens of wealth or status, but through the purity of character. That small act of kindness shattered the invisible wall she had been taught to keep between herself and people below her class. She realized her world of luxury often overlooked the silent struggles of people like him, people who worked day and night just to survive. While her world was filled with excess she didn't even appreciate. Yet he, with so little, carried himself with more grace and humility than anyone in her rich circle ever had. Each day after that moment, she began to notice things she had once ignored. The way he greeted every worker with respect, the way his smile brought comfort even when he himself was tired, the way his presence made people feel safe, not just physically, but emotionally. There was strength in him that went beyond muscles. It was the strength of character, resilience, and compassion. She started to ask herself questions she had never dared to think about before. What is the meaning of wealth if it blinds us to the humanity of others? What is the value of riches if they can't buy genuine kindness? And why had she lived all these years believing that love should follow rules of race, color, or class? The more she observed him, the more she realized that love is not found in glittering halls, but in moments of truth. In gestures so small yet so powerful, they stay etched in your heart forever. She realized that sometimes the richest people are not those who sit in mansions, but those who carry goodness in their hearts even when the world gives them nothing. In him, she saw a man who owned nothing material compared to her, yet somehow he seemed to own something far greater: peace with himself, a wealth of character, a dignity that could not be bought. And in that realization, the seed of love was planted. It was fragile, unspoken, and unacknowledged, but it was there. She didn't tell him. He didn't know it yet. But her heart had already crossed a line her family would never accept. The millionaire's girl who had everything found, herself captivated not by money, not by power, but by a man society would look down upon. And that truth whispered louder than any noise around her. The world may measure worth in gold, but the heart measures worth in humanity. And that is where her story truly began. Day after day, she found herself looking for reasons to pass by the gates where he stood, as though her heart was silently guiding her toward him. The millionaire's girl had grown up with people who spoke to her with politeness, but never with honesty, who surrounded her for her family's wealth, but never for her soul. And yet, here was a man, a black security guard, who didn't see her as a prize or a ticket to fortune. He barely spoke at first, just offered a respectful nod, a simple smile, But even those gestures felt more real than the rehearsed compliments she had heard her whole life. It was in those quiet exchanges, seconds that seemed like eternity, that something unexplainable began to grow between them. The world around her was full of noise, parties, business deals, and luxury cars arriving and leaving. But with him, there was silence, and strangely, that silence spoke more than words ever could. She started to notice how his eyes lit up when she laughed, even if he tried to hide it, and how her heart skipped when his deep voice carried a "Good morning, miss," that felt less like routine and more like warmth. The walls of wealth that had separated them slowly began to dissolve, not through grand gestures, but through the small and genuine ones, the kind that most people overlook, but the kind that change hearts forever. At night, she would lie awake, replaying every word they had shared, every glance that lingered a second too long, and she would feel a mix of joy and fear. Joy, because she had discovered a connection purer than anything money had ever bought her. Fear, because she knew her family and society would never allow her to cross the invisible line she was already stepping over. She wasn't supposed to see him as anything more than an employee. Yet the truth was undeniable. She was slowly falling. For him, not for his position, but for the soul that radiated through him. He, too, felt something, though he carried it with restraint. He had lived long enough to know the cruelty of a world that judged a man by the color of his skin and the balance of his bank account. So he kept his feelings buried, choosing instead to find happiness in the little moments. A shared smile, a short conversation, the way her presence seemed to soften even the harshest days. To him, even that was enough, because love, in its truest form, does not demand. It simply exists. Their bond became a language without words. A glance was a sentence. A smile was a paragraph. A silence was a chapter filled with emotions too deep to explain. They lived in those stolen seconds, in the spaces between expectations, in the shadows of a world that would never understand. The millionaire's girl, who had everything, and the black security guard, who had nothing in material terms, found themselves richer than anyone else, because they had discovered a truth that few dare to embrace. Sometimes the most powerful love stories are written not in luxury, but in silence. And it was in that silence, heavy with meaning and fragile with fear, that both of them realized love doesn't always arrive with loud declarations. It grows quietly, like a seed pushing through the hardest soil, proving that, even in a world full of prejudice, hearts still find each other. And that silence, though unspoken, was louder than the world's disapproval. It was only a matter of time before whispers became storms. The mansion was a place where secrets could not stay hidden for long, where every glance was watched, and every action was measured. The millionaire's girl had thought their silent bond was theirs alone, a treasure safely kept between her heart and his presence at the gates. But one evening her father's sharp eyes caught the softness in her smile, as she exchanged words with the black security guard. That single moment shattered the illusion of safety, and the storm came crashing down. Her family did not see kindness in him, did not see dignity or character. All they saw was skin, status, and a love they believed was forbidden. The confrontation was brutal. Her father's voice roared through the marble halls, each word dripping with venom, each insult cutting deeper than a blade. He accused her of bringing shame, of lowering herself, of disrespecting the very name that had built their fortune. Her mother wept not for her daughter's pain, but for the possibility of gossip, for the stain on their reputation, if society ever found out. And then came the words that pierced her like fire. "He is not your equal. He is nothing. His place is at the gates, not by your side." In those words, the mask of racism revealed itself. Ugly, cruel, and heartless. She tried to defend him, her voice shaking yet brave, insisting that he was more of a man than anyone she had ever met. But her family's ears were closed, sealed by prejudice passed down through generations. The security guard, too, felt the weight of their scorn. They hurled insults, not just at his poverty, but at the very color of his skin, as though his humanity could be diminished by the shade he was born in. He stood in silence, his pride fighting against the humiliation, but inside, every word was a wound. He had always known the world could be cruel, but hearing it so openly from those who claimed to be above him was a pain no one should bear. For the girl, it was the first time she truly tasted the cruelty of a world she had been sheltered from. She realized that racism was not always distant or hidden. Sometimes it sat across the dinner table, disguised as family values. Sometimes it dressed itself as protection while destroying everything love tried to build. She saw the truth that privilege can blind people, making them believe they own the right to decide who is worthy of love. But in the midst of the pain, there was also clarity. She looked at him, not at his uniform, not at his status, but at the quiet strength in his eyes. And she knew her family was wrong. The world could strip him of respect, but it could never strip him of the humanity and dignity he carried inside. That realization carved itself into her heart. Love is not shameful, but hate is. As she stood between her family's cruelty and the man she cared for, she felt her heart split in two, torn between the blood that raised her and the love that healed her. And in that breaking, she understood a truth that would stay with her forever. Racism does not only destroy its victims, it destroys the very souls of those who practice it. In a house full of gold, she realized her family was poorer than ever, because they had lost the ability to see humanity. And that night, her silent vow was born. If love must fight, then fight it shall. Because no color, no wealth, no prejudice will ever change the truth of a heart that dares to love. The walls of her world had never felt so suffocating. She had grown up surrounded by every luxury, every comfort that money could provide. Yet in that moment, all of it felt like chains wrapped tightly around her heart. The millionaire's girl, who had been taught that wealth was power, now stood, powerless before her own family's expectations. They wanted her to forget the black security guard, to erase the feelings that had grown between them, to bury her heart under the weight of legacy. But love is not a thing that can be commanded, and the more they told her to walk away, the more her soul clung to him. She stood at a crossroads where no path was easy. One led to a life of obedience, riches, and hollow acceptance, while the other led to struggle, rejection, and pain, but carried the only thing she had ever truly wanted: love that was real. Her nights became endless battles of thought. She would sit by her window, looking down at the gates where he stood, and tears would fall not because she doubted her feelings, but because she knew the price of them. If she chose him, she would lose her family's support, their fortune, and the safety of the world she had always known. If she abandoned him, she would keep the riches but lose herself, because how could she live a life built on denying the truth of her own heart? Every option was heavy, But she knew one carried a deeper cost than the other, the cost of betraying love. He, too, carried the weight of the choice. He told her more than once, in hushed tones, that she should not risk everything for him, that he was not worth the battles she would have to fight. But she saw through his words, saw the love he tried to protect her from, and knew that he was only afraid of being the reason her life crumbled. It was not his worth that was in question. It was the cruelty of a society that measured worth by status and color. And that was the very reason she felt she could not turn away. To choose him was not only to choose love, it was to choose truth over lies, humanity over prejudice, courage over fear. The pressure grew with every passing day. Her father threatened to cut her off. Her mother warned her of disgrace. Friends whispered behind her back. And yet her heart never wavered. She had been raised to inherit fortunes, but in her heart she had inherited something greater, a desire to live a life of meaning. What was the value of diamonds if they could not shine light on injustice? What was the purpose of money if it chained her to a life without love? Finally, she understood the truth that set her free. Wealth can give comfort, but it cannot give life to the soul. Choosing him was not the end of her world. It was the beginning of truly living. Standing in the face of her family's fury, she lifted her head and decided. She would walk the harder road, not because it was easy, but because it was right. The millionaire's girl, who could have had everything, chose the one thing that mattered. Love that was pure, fearless, and unbreakable. And in that choice, she whispered a message not just to herself, but to the world. Legacies fade, fortunes vanish, but love built on truth is eternal. The day she chose him was the day everything changed. The millionaire's girl, who had been sheltered by walls of wealth, stepped into a storm she could never have imagined. But for the first time in her life, she felt alive. Her family's rejection was harsh, society's whispers were cruel, and the judgment in people's eyes was heavy. But none of it was enough to silence the truth. Her heart had already spoken. She walked beside the black security guard, not as a girl blinded by rebellion, but as a woman who had discovered that love was worth every sacrifice. And with each step she took away from privilege and closer to him, she discovered a freedom she had never tasted in her golden prison. They faced ridicule, sneers, and endless gossip. At events, people stared as though their love was an act of defiance. At times, the silence of those who disapproved was louder than open insults. Yet every cruel glance only bound them closer together. Because when the world pointed fingers, they found strength in holding hands. When the world mocked, they smiled at each other, knowing that love had given them courage to face storms others couldn't survive. The mansion had given her comfort, but with him, even the simplest bench in the park felt like home. It wasn't easy. There were nights when doubt crept in, when the weight of society's rejection pressed against their shoulders. He worried about her, worried she would regret walking away from the fortune and status she was born into. But she would always silence his fears by reminding him that wealth without love was emptiness, while struggle with love was abundance. He, in turn, gave her the greatest gift any human could offer: steadfast loyalty, a love that did not waver even when the world demanded it should. And slowly, their story became more than just a romance. It became a quiet revolution. People who once doubted began to notice the strength of their bond. Some who had mocked them in the beginning found themselves humbled, realizing that what they had witnessed was not rebellion, but a rare truth: that love, when genuine, cannot be broken. by color, class, or cruelty. Even those who held on to their prejudice could not deny what they saw. The happiness in her eyes, the peace in his presence, the undeniable reality that their love had survived every storm thrown at it. The lesson of their story is one that reaches far beyond them. Racism seeks to divide, wealth seeks to control, society seeks to dictate, but love, when chosen with courage, seeks only to unite. The Millionaire's girl and the black security guard became living proof that love is not a weakness but the greatest strength. They showed the world that true richness lies not in gold, but in the willingness to see another soul as equal, worthy, and beautiful. And so their journey became a voice for everyone who has ever been told their love was not enough, for every heart that has been judged by skin or status. Their story whispered to the world that love is not blind. It sees more clearly than anything else. It sees beyond prejudice, beyond barriers, beyond fear. The Millionaire's girl who once had everything, and the black security guard who had nothing created a love that had more value than all the fortunes in the world. And with every breath they took together, they reminded humanity of the one truth that cannot be denied. Hate can divide, but only love has the power to heal.